Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another in a series of events that the Center for International Private Enterprise is putting on in our COVID-19 and corruption series. This one is entitled The Rapid Responders, and my name is Frank Brown, and I head up the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center here at CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise. A couple technical housekeeping points to mention before we get underway. All questions and comments should come through the chat function, so be sure to use that. You'll find it down at the bottom of your screen in orange, and we'll be going through the questions submitted there. The format today will be about 30 minutes of presentations, and then as we always do, we'll leave about 60 minutes for questions and answers at the end of the session. So by way of background, the Center for International Private Enterprise is an NGO based in Washington, D.C. We're affiliated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and we're one of the core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy. The Anti-Corruption and Governance Center is part of CIPE, and we focus on anti-corruption compliance work in about 20 markets around the world, and we also focus on something we call integrated compliance, which looks at not only corruption risks that companies face, but also risks posed by labor and environmental issues, companies' ability to meet international standards on on labor and environmental issues. And our third line of work, one that's relevant to today's subject, is something we call rapid response. And that's an effort to very quickly mobilize support for anti-corruption reformers in countries where there's been a sudden change in orientation. So if you think about Ukraine in 2014, when somewhat unexpectedly a new government came to power, in part because of tremendous frustration over corruption, that's a place that we would have intervened very quickly to support civil society. And so what we've done around the world is intervene in places like the Gambia and Sudan, Armenia, Malaysia. And the idea is that when there's an election or a revolution that brings anti-corruption reformers to power, they need support more quickly than the international communities can sometimes provide. And so that's what our rapid reaction program does overall. And that, of course, relates directly to our offering today, which is looking at the COVID-19 crisis and some of the first anti-corruption responses to it around the world. And this is very interesting, I think, certainly to CIPE, but I think to the broader anti-corruption community as well, because there will be lots of lessons learned coming from the global community's response to this crisis, specifically the meeting the corruption challenge. There will be sort of traditional forms of corruption that we're likely to see regarding procurement, but there may be one specific to a healthcare crisis regarding all kinds of fraud and false claims for medical solutions to the pandemic. There may be price gouging, but a whole host of issues that are specific to this crisis. So I'm very much looking forward to our three presenters today. Each of them represents a speedy and holistic approach to the crisis in different parts of the world, as you'll learn. The one with the sort of biggest global reach is Joe Powell. And by way of introduction, Joe Powell is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Open Government Partnership, or OGP. He leads OGP's global engagements in 78 countries, including working with the OGP Steering Committee, OGP Summits, and linking OGP with other multilateral processes. He previously worked for the One campaign, where he was managing One's global campaign for increased transparency in the extractive industries. Joe holds a BA from the University of Cambridge. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joe. Joe?
Thanks so much, Frank. And thanks to CIPE for organizing this really important discussion. I'll be running a few slides through, hopefully won't be too difficult to follow. Just as a reminder of who we are at the Open Government Partnership, in addition to what Frank said on the next slide, you'll just see a reminder of of who we are. So if we can go to the next slide. So OGP now has 78 national member countries. We also have an increasing number of local governments who are joining OGP. Hopefully some of you have joined from countries that are members. But we're a government civil society platform. So there are also thousands and thousands of civil society organizations who are part of the OGP community. And OGP is a very practical organization in the sense that we don't just talk about issues like corruption. Our members make specific reforms and commitments through action plans on different parts of corruption and open government. And those are all monitored independently. So there's accountability for those actions. And we can get more into this later, but I'd rather focus on the substance of the issue first. So if you look at the next slide, what does it mean? What have some of our members been doing historically pre-COVID on anti-corruption? And this just gives you a sense of some of the issues, particularly on the prevention side of using open government, open data and access to information, and working with civil society to prevent corruption. For example, in open contracting, as Frank mentioned, opening up procurement systems, on registers of who owns and controls companies, on extractive industry transparency, on political lobbying and money in politics, and more generally on open budgeting and fiscal transparency. So you can see a lot of relevant reforms that many countries were already undertaking pre-COVID that have become even more relevant in this crisis. So to give you a sense of just practically what this looks like in a country example, another one Frank mentioned in his introduction on the next slide, let me just take you to Armenia. And this in a sense was again a pre-COVID rapid reaction. Many of you will be familiar with this story in Armenia where during the Velvet Revolution, activists, civil society, journalists, opposition politicians took to the streets in part motivated by corruption concerns with the previous government. And it was a citizen-led movement that brought the Pashminan government into power. And of course, a lot of expectations were raised in Armenia about how this government could respond to those citizen demands for a more open society, a more open government. And where OGP has come into this picture is being a space where these demands from the streets, if you like, were turned into concrete reforms to respond to that demand. So Armenia is currently working on beneficial ownership transparency. It's working on extractives transparency, open contracting, and so on. And there's a big role for the private sector in Armenia as well. And I know CIPE have also been working there, and we'd love to work more with CIPE on Armenia. So these are pre-COVID. If you go to the next slide, of course, like any organization, we had to adapt and pivot very quickly when the pandemic started. And our approach was really to listen to what our member governments and civil society partners around the world said that they needed in the short term. What were the rapid things they really needed? And what we were hearing is that while it was clear that the response and recovery to COVID was fundamentally about effective governance, and that there were a lot of open solutions that were actually enhancing the response and recovery, there was also a significant increased risk in corruption and in authoritarian, further authoritarian grabs for power. And I'm sure many people on this webinar by now will have their own example from countries you're familiar with, whether it's PPP contracting in that many US states had to grapple with price gouging and corruption. In Colombia, I was just reading last night the story where the Attorney General has charged 10 mayors with corruption. And I'm sure we could go region by region and there would be different examples. So the next slide shows you what the approach, the strategic approach we took to thinking about this first phase of response. Clearly, there's a big need for open health data, including on the models that scientists were using to make decisions about lockdowns and such like. In some countries, we've now moved beyond that. In others, including in the US, that's still an extremely important element of the response. A really interesting area of response was how civil society and citizens were mobilizing themselves to play an active role. And of course, as mentioned, this emergency procurement for health supplies, again, a significant corruption risk, something that a lot of our government members in OGP were grappling with. Even if they had systems set up before, they weren't always integrated with the medical supply chains, for example. And finally, the big increase in need for emergency safety net provision, especially for those in the informal economy who I'm sure we'll get onto, can be harder to reach with some of these government programs. So if you like, this was the first phase of response. The next slide is where I'll focus a bit more, which is on the kind of recovery phase. And here, of course, we're seeing really significant financial flows in many countries around the world. In Africa, the UN Economic Commission for Africa estimates that the stimulus packages amount to about 7.5% of GDP. Some of that is coming from national budgets, some of it is coming from the international financial institutions, but of course this huge injection of economic stimulus money moving very quickly through the system does leave a risk in terms of oversight and accountability and effectiveness of assuring that money reaches those that really need it most. And I know Hamzy will talk about how civil society has a key role in following that money. But we're also very keen to see how core open government practices can actually make those stimulus and safety net packages more effective. So opening up the budgets, the contracts, being clear about what companies are receiving support. That was, again, a controversial issue in the US, but also countries like Canada, Denmark, and others have said that companies registered in tax havens should not be eligible for that stimulus support, which is an interesting development, but also why and how decisions are being made around that money. So transparency over lobbying, over those packages, and ensuring that they actually really reach the people that need it most. So there's a huge risk and opportunity, it feels like right now in many countries where these stimulus packages are just getting online. And that's where I think this group gathered here this morning has a big role to play. And the next slide, just again to make it concrete, and again, not to steal Hamzy's thunder, because I know he'll talk about this, but Nigeria is an interesting example because under the Buhari administration, Nigeria joined OGP and made a number of commitments on anti-corruption, including open budgets, extractive transparency, as I've mentioned, the beneficial ownership commitment and others. And of course, those commitments are now being really tested. There's a 3 trillion naira stimulus package, that's about $6 billion going through to the assembly at the moment. And this incredible expertise in civil society with Code and others who have been working on following the money before COVID hit. So the question is, what are the gaps in this system? Where are the specific reforms or requests of government that are needed on the transparency end, and the capacity and support to civil society on the follow the money end, and then also the pressure to respond to what civil society is saying. So it's not just following the money in a monitoring sense, but also following it in collaboration with government to make the overall stimulus package more effective. So let me just in the final part just mention a couple of tools that I think might be useful to people that have joined this webinar. So if you go to the next slide and the next one, there's just a few things I wanted to highlight and then I'll close. We at OGP had a crowdsourcing effort as soon as the pandemic hit to ask our community for examples of where open government solutions were helping support an effective response and recovery. There's over 400 of those now on our website. Interestingly, they came about 60% from governments, but also a significant portion from civil society, showing that civil society's key role in responding to the pandemic. The majority of these were related to access to information, so things like portals to show open data on cases, hotlines to report corruption and so on. So clearly there is a gap on the accountability side that we might want to discuss, as we move to the next phase of the recovery. But this is an interesting database for anyone to explore and see if there are examples from your country. The next slide shows another tool that we've been working on. This is in collaboration with many of our partners from around the world. And it's a very practical guide for how open government can help in different areas. Some of these I've already talked about, but also issues like access to justice, aid transparency, privacy in terms of digital tools and digital surveillance concerns. These are all on our website. It's a very practical. These are not long policy documents. They're very practical mini guides with tools and examples of reforms and initiatives happening right now that could be relevant to your country. So I really encourage people to take a look at that and see how you might adapt and apply it to your context if relevant. On the next slide, you'll see we're also at OGP hosting conversations like this, whether on different policy areas or regionally. Yesterday we hosted one for the Africa region. These are all recorded, they're online, they could also be interesting. And the final thing I'll share, and then I'll close, is that none of this will be possible, if you go to the next slide, none of this is possible without civic space and the ability for journalists to operate freely, for civil society to operate freely. Unfortunately, even within OGP countries, we have seen some closing of civic space in the COVID-19 context. For example, 15 of our countries have suspended or restricted right to information. At a minimum, this needs to roll back in the next few months. But actually, many of these provisions we think are not justified by the current crisis, and there should be immediate action for them. So if we are to work together to prevent corruption in the response and recovery, having the civic space to do that is essential, and again, something we want to work with all of you on. So let me stop there and turn back to you, Frank.
Thank you very much, Joe. And listening to your presentation, I right away could think of 3 or 4 questions that I'd like to ask to follow up and learn more. And to those of you listening, if you have questions and would like to pose them to any of the presenters, please just type them into the chat section and we'll be sure to get to them in the Q&A section, which will come in about 20-25 minutes. Next up, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Lola Adekanye, who's based in Lagos, Nigeria. And Lola heads up the anti-corruption and business integrity practice in Africa for CIPE. And it's really hard to overestimate Lola's contribution to CIPE's anti-corruption work. That's in part because of her own background. She's a barrister in Nigeria and the US. It's also, and she's worked at the World Bank as well, it's also due to her willingness to take risks in a business where, of course, we're all about managing risks. So that's sometimes a challenge, but the dividends from that have been some of the most innovative programs that CIPE implements around the world. And I'm always learning from Lola. So it's a pleasure to introduce Lola Adekanye from Lagos with CIPE. Lola?
Hello, everyone, and thank you so very much, Frank, for that introduction. I certainly didn't know it was me you were talking about till you said my name. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, just listening to Joe's presentation, I was just thinking about how CIPE programs have been this, at least our Africa anti-corruption program especially, which is, you know, an outcome of a lot of work that CIPE has done around anti-corruption programming that takes a business-led approach. I was just thinking about how what we've done in the last 3 to 4 years has really helped us position ourselves to be able to rapidly respond to the, you know, crises and the problems that we're seeing in many of the countries where we work in sub-Saharan Africa on the anti-corruption program. In 2017, we started to take a very hard look at how to work with the business community more on getting them more effective in combating corruption, in holding, you know, governments accountable, in helping civil society keep the civic space open in the different countries where you know, civil society has worked really hard to push back at corruption. And that's you know, we took that approach because we've learned over time, we've seen a lot of the anti-corruption efforts or interventions around the world have really targeted government institutions. You know, you see things like strengthening legal and legislative framework around, you know, mitigating corruption. You see, you know, with the UNCAC, you have the UNODC strengthening law enforcement capacities, dealing with the hard issues around tackling corruption. I'll call them the hard issues because they focus on the policy and the law and the capacity of the government to hold citizens, but also government officials accountable. What I call the soft issues is really around the social and accountability dynamics that, you know, these interventions have not grasped quite as well. And you know, those are the things that influence the culture in the countries where we work. Where there are strong anti-corruption laws on the books, for instance, in Nigeria and Ghana, where we have strong anti-corruption laws, or in Kenya, the question becomes, how well are those laws being implemented? How effectively are they being implemented in order to change behavior over time? And that's really where we talk about, you know, an intervention that is good, but one that's sustainable would change behavior over time. And so that's why CIPE, you know, traditionally working to support the private sector in strengthening government institutions, we started to focus on what social and accountability capacities can the business community bring to tackling to this conversation about corruption and to efforts to tackle and mitigate and push back on corruption. So in 2017, looking critically at this, we started with, well, why don't we have the business community clean house first? And so we started to work on a network, an anti-corruption compliance network, the AACN, of professionals who will help businesses, one business at a time. A goal is to get to a critical mass of businesses in the countries. We're in 12 countries right now, and we have 13 partners in these countries, where we'll have more and more businesses in a position to hold their internal governance systems accountable to core values of ethics and integrity. And then through collective action and collaboration with civil society, hold the government accountable to. With this network of partners that we've been working with over the last few years, we started to learn in more detail what we should be doing differently about, you know, tackling corruption. There are a few hard lessons we've learned and very good lessons. One of them being, you know, you have to think about rehabilitation in some cases when you're talking about, you know, a corrupt system, because you might just find that you're in a system where everyone has tainted, you know, practices. And so we're thinking about training, we're thinking about mentoring, we're thinking about a, you know, diverse array of capacity building techniques. But another thing we've also had to introduce, in addition to the network, or we're working on now, it's going to launch in the summer, is a platform that incentivizes businesses to act responsibly, to operate ethically with integrity, to meet internationally recognized standards of, you know, anti-bribery and compliance and governance control systems in their business, especially small and mid-sized enterprises that would never, you know, have exposure to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for instance, and never feel the pressure from international law enforcement to have to do this. We're creating an incentive for a critical mass of businesses in these countries who can then become, you know, a force for advocacy. So this is the landscape that we've had, or the resources or networks that we've had before the pandemic. Once the pandemic hit, we started to interact with this network, and you can hit the next slide, Kai. And our thinking was, well, there are all the opportunities for and the risks of corruption problems to increase, with with the COVID relief spending by the government growing dramatically overnight, and with businesses also facing a crunch where they're having to make tough decisions about boycotting procurement processes because they have the network and ability to do that. You have also issues of price gouging that's common. You also have businesses bypassing regulatory requirements for instance, making PPEs and the like. If you hit the next slide for me, we'll go into how we came to our emergency response. Having this, firm grasp of, what our network, of partners face in the different countries, we were asking very specific questions about how we can help, what our partners can do, what our, organized private sector partners can do, what our civil society affiliate organizations should be doing, what are the challenges right now that they have with regards to the civic space being open, and the ability for businesses to respond to the challenges that businesses themselves are facing. And we came up with, 3 main objectives for a grant competition that we put out for our partners and the broader network of civil society organizations to apply for. And really the objectives were focusing on things that we had heard. We know that, with the risks in the business community, more and more businesses were worried about, having to lay off staff, having to violate contracts that they have open, or having to bribe government officials to, get around the supply chain disruption issues that they had. And so we started to look at, well, okay, how can we help businesses act ethically while making tough decisions? This would require a combination of things, from training to capacity to advocate. Many businesses in Africa, we're learning now that the compliance program as we know it for businesses must include what we call like a collective action, component in it. And many companies in Africa, for now, still don't have compliance or anti-corruption systems as a base requirement, a baseline requirement, much less, the understanding that collective action is a strong part of their response to corruption problems. And so during the pandemic, businesses are now learning that collective action is critical to, to being able to operate as a business properly, because you start off with things like licenses being revoked overnight because of the pandemic, restriction in mobility and the likes. And for instance, banks are not allowed to transact in a certain way. Daily wage earners are not, companies in the quasi-informal sector are not able to transact, even though they could be considered essential services. And the only way around doing this is either break the law or act collectively with your local chamber of commerce or other industry association. And so these were the challenges that, businesses were facing, and we were learning about these. Then there were also, violations of, human rights protections and even violation of the law. For instance, a factory in South Africa had its employees working locked up and working for a period of time until they got busted by the law enforcement authorities. You had things like that happening, and of course businesses were acting in this way because of the crisis of the situation. And so we decided to come up with these 3 objectives, made them as broad as possible, bearing in mind 2 things. 1, we need to respond right now to the transparency and accountability and ethics and integrity issues that we face right now. And 2, remembering that in 2015, the World Economic Forum, showed us a very interesting global risk mapping, and a pandemic like this one, the spread of infectious diseases, was one of the global risks that could, significantly change how businesses are done, the economic landscape. And at the time, it wasn't one of the very high risks, but it was there. And so now we know that whatever we're doing now to, prepare for responding to this pandemic, we can learn from that for the future, just in case we have to have an emergency system again. Many countries, many businesses, large businesses, didn't have an emergency procurement protocol. And now we're learning that it's time to start thinking that we should have an emergency procurement protocol that could be part of like a disaster recovery type of protocol. And so we put out these objectives, and we had, in 4 weeks, we had about 47 applications, impressive turnout to be frank. And we tried hard to review those, and we settled for 4 organizations that had outstanding applications. Pretty much like, many of the applications were very strong, and these ones did a few things. They responded to the now, and they created solutions that would have sustainable impact for the future. And so the grants will be implemented starting this summer with partners in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Ghana, and in Zimbabwe. The focus, if you hit the next slide, you can see like a summary, right? Yeah, that's it. You can see a summary of what the grantees will be working on, which essentially really tackles 3 of the high priority issues that many of our partners picked up upon, which is the lack of transparency in the procurement process. In Zimbabwe, for instance, we had a very interesting case that's in our July issue of the newsletter. And it's really just about how the procurement system has broken down so much that the government engaged a company that was incorporated only in 2020, this year, from Dubai, without any traces of who the owners of the company is, engaged them to supply PPEs at a 200% markup of the price that the government could have bought it in Zimbabwe. Yet there's still very, very limited, huge shortage in supply of healthcare resources for the healthcare sector in Zimbabwe. And so we have a procurement reform, advocacy and reform component to the Zimbabwe project. In Kenya, we have a very strong advocacy component that will target procurement reforms, but with a strong cooperative angle with the private sector. In Ghana, the Ghanaian grant will take a very holistic view at the government's response, looking across the spectrum. There are about 23 points in which the government has advanced the emergency relief efforts, including with reducing the bills for utilities for small businesses, and providing relief funds for a demographic of the business community, and many more. And so the partner in Ghana will conduct a risk assessment on all of the emergency responses and come up with a concrete reform or recommendation plan for the government to make sure that it's effective. And finally, the Ethiopia project has a very interesting component to it, where there will be a whistleblower or confidential reporting capacity for companies and citizens to report, abuse in public spending or in implementation of government programs towards the relief, interventions. And there will also be a survey to follow that, but from that will come recommendations to the government about the kinds of reforms that need to happen for stronger transparency and accountability in the government, in the public to private sector transaction and interaction, not only relating to the COVID-19 relief fund spending. That's a goal for Ethiopia. So I'll stop there. I'm very happy to answer questions. I think I will hand over to Frank now, and come back if there are any more questions.
Thank you, Lola. That was great. And we're looking forward to asking you a bunch of follow-up questions. So next up, we have our third and final speaker. Before I introduce him, I wanted to remind folks that if you have questions you'd like to ask of any of the presenters, please type them into the chat box, and I'll put them to the presenters. Also, Lola had mentioned an anti-corruption newsletter. That's one of many pieces of information we push out. If you'd like to sign up for our WhatsApp channel on COVID-19 and corruption, or to get our own ACGC newsletter, or the newsletter that Lola mentioned, just drop us a line in the chat box or at the email you'll see at the end of the presentations. So with that, I'd like to introduce Hamzat Lawal, who goes by Hamzi. When I was doing research on Hamzi, I came across his Twitter feed, which is, I think, close to 100,000 followers. So that gives you a sense of the heft and influence he has, not only in Nigeria, but globally. By way of background, Hamzi has a track record of holding governments accountable to deliver on commitments to social programs, and has successfully led grassroots campaigns in over 40 African countries. He is the founder and chief executive of Connected Development, CODE. Founded in 2012, CODE is the largest social accountability and transparency organization in Africa. Their Follow the Money program trains young people in grassroots communities to monitor government and international aid spending on social goods and to hold governments accountable. To date, they have built 50 community governance structures capacity to monitor the implementation of $10 million budgeted for social infrastructure in 191 communities. Follow the Money was awarded the United Nations SDG Action Award in 2019. So with that, I'll turn it over to Hamzi. Hamzi?
Thank you very much, Frank. Hello, everyone. After the outbreak of COVID-19 in Nigeria around February, our government started mobilizing resources to respond, and we started getting international support. And for us, we thought that since Follow the Money have grassroots spread, and we have a membership base of over 6,000 people across Africa, it would be nice to test how we can use digital tools to run effective campaign around transparency and accountability. So we launched a digital transparency campaign called Follow COVID-19 Money hashtag. For us, we wanted to, first of all, map and document all the resources that are being donated by private individual, private institution, international community, and our government. Secondly, we want to ensure transparency in the disbursement and utilization of these resources, so that the Ministry of Health and NCDC, who are first responders, would ensure transparency. And of course, ensure that judicious use of these resources, knowing that this is an emergency and they would be emergency procurement. Next slide, please. Also is to ensure that, next slide, please. Also to ensure that we tackle the issue of misinformation and fake news. Sometime in April, the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning issue a disclaimer, countering the misinformation that has gone viral, that we also got so many calls to verify this information. So beyond ensuring transparency and accountability is to also use data to curb fake news and misinformation. Next, please. As much as the campaign kick-started in Nigeria, and I will get to Nigeria, so our colleague in Cameroon also started engaging their government. So we had about 8 countries join this campaign. So in Cameroon, for instance, we were using both English and French to educate citizens, but also to engage governments. The president of Cameroon set up the presidential task force, where they had a cabinet minister who chairs the task force, and we were using Twitter feeds to collect information, using radio also to gather data, but also putting this data side by side what this presidential task force has announced that have been procured and supplied to various healthcare facilities. Next, please. So in Kenya, our partner, CIDEREC, that works in one of the biggest slum in Nairobi. We leverage in Kenya, beyond leveraging on what we call this slum radio that disseminates information, in Kiswahili. We also collected publicly available data, but we run a weekly Twitter engagement dialogue using Open Budget Kenya, where we're sharing data around COVID-19 resources and also getting feedback from government. And some of our feedback has also informed legislative dialogue around how citizens are engaging in Kenya. And this is just a data visualization on how much money so far have been contributed, in Kenya to respond to COVID-19. Next, please. In Cameroon, yes, in Liberia. In Liberia, interestingly, our colleague in Liberia is part of the government task force to provide watch services and oversee watch services in public spaces like the market and other public utility spaces to ensure that they're actually providing water, soap, hand sanitizers, and face masks. And so what we've done is we've collected publicly available data. So for instance, the World Bank have supported the government in Liberia with $1.5 million. UBA also, but financial institutions like UBA have supported the government. And so far also we've looked at how much the government have disbursed in Liberia to provide watch services and also support low-income households in Liberia. Next, please. In Zimbabwe, it's quite interesting in Zimbabwe because first when there was the outbreak, the Ministry of Health in Zimbabwe was working with Follow the Money to do contact tracing. So we built an app that works with Google to highlight, the flash points where you have outbreak of COVID-19 so that people would not necessarily travel to that area, but also help the government in doing contact tracing. And we got data on even the numbers of tests that have been done in Zimbabwe. So far, over $1 million have gone on donation to COVID-19 in Zimbabwe. Next, please. Yes, so in Nigeria, where we started the Follow COVID-19 campaign, so far we've publicly mapped over $200 million that have gone towards COVID-19. And if you look at the data, international donors have actually donated much more money than, but money government have put in, and both individuals and private institutions. And so what we started with in Nigeria was to first using freedom of information request to ask government, so how much has gone into responding to COVID-19. Our Ministry for Humanitarian Affairs and Disaster Control said they've spent over $56 million on conditional cash transfer because the president approved cumulative payments for poor households in the country. And Aliko Dangote and the CBN governor is co-chairing CACOVID, which is a private sector-led coalition. And the last time we got data from them, they've actually mobilized about $76 million to respond towards COVID-19. So we're leveraging also on FOI letters, hosting town hall meeting and working with media partners to amplify this information. Next, please. So we got data from the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, and this is the spread of the people who benefited from the conditional cash payment from the data source, where over 11 million households, 11 million individuals from 2.5 million households directly benefited from the $56 million palliative that government provided during COVID-19 lockdown. Next, please. So governments always invite Follow the Money to come and monitor and document how they're also responding in terms of providing palliative to poor households and community. And this picture just illustrates, the palliative that government is organizing. But also, so Follow the Money, after government's launch and distribution, we follow up with beneficiaries to get feedback on this palliative, and just to also ensure value for money, and to use this data to inform government on open contracting standard. Next, please. And as Joe mentioned, there's been conversation with the Minister for State for Budget and Planning. But this is me engaging a cabinet minister, the Minister for State for FCT, giving her feedback, direct feedback on what community members and grassroots voices are saying on the ground, and also informing their overall strategy on responding towards COVID-19 and providing palliative to cushion the effects of the lockdown in Nigeria. Next, please. So for us, we leverage on social media, and we have millions of followership on social media. So we create content using infographics, illustration that would engage conversation and collect more feedback around, following COVID-19 money, mobilizing more young people on ifollowthemoney.org, and also getting government to respond. So for instance, on Twitter, we have NNPC, who at first had committed $30 million towards COVID-19, engage us on Twitter. The Minister for the Minister for FCT engaged us on Twitter, and most time we get positive feedback and response both from government and the public engagement on Twitter. And so far, we're running about 50 radio programs in local language using Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba. In Nigeria and Kenya, East Africa, we're using Kiswahili. In Cameroon, we're using French and English to share this knowledge, share this information, and get feedback. I just have 2 slides left. So the next one is just a short video about, so if you can hit play, please. Overtime in Africa. Next slide, please. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hamsi. That was great. And thank you to all our presenters. A reminder one more time, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat function. We've got one that's come in for Lola. And just as a reminder, we have about 45 minutes left for questions, and we try to reserve time during each of these events for the Q&A, because that's, I think, where a lot of the value is for those people attending. So the question for Lola comes from a Ben Schmidt, and he asks, what is the range of size for these business associations in Africa? Are there associations that are relatively small, like 20 to 30 businesses, and others that are larger, hundreds of businesses? Has the relative size of these associations affected their ability to get government to listen to their concerns during the pandemic? And that's for you, Lola.
Hi, so I was just typing a response to that, but I can talk about it again. To the question of size, so it varies from country to country, and if you're talking at the national level or subnational level or a county level, you will find that at a national level in a country like Kenya, Nigeria, in Ethiopia, where there's very active business, participation in, public policy dialogue and advocacy, the associations are typically big, over 100, membership base, well over 100 members in such associations. And at, subnational level or at the county level, You may not have those big associations like 400 people, 4,000. The Lagos Chamber of Commerce, for instance, which is a subnational association in Nigeria and in Lagos State, I believe have over, I think it's over 3,000 thereabout members. They have about 400 active members in only one category, one grouping. And at the county level, you are likely to have, which is at the local government level, you're likely to have associations that have well over 50, 80 people as well. So you're not likely to have really tiny associations that are involved in advocacy and policy dialogue that have only about 30 businesses. They might be more like cooperatives and the like. What we do as CIPE to support these associations so that, and then the other thing is the size of the association often does make a difference in most cases. And it just depends on the country again. In Nigeria and in Kenya, the size of the association is a factor that helps drive, or push governments to respond to the demands. But what we do is we have very particular, interventions or support for different organizations or technical assistance that we give to our different partners in different countries. So for instance, in Nigeria, at the subnational level, where there are so many associations that are not big enough to get the local government or the subnational government's response, we've built coalitions of, we call them coalitions of business associations and professional associations. And that makes them a big force to reckon with. So that's one way we, try to create political relevance for associations that may not be big enough to, to get the government to respond to them. In Kenya, we have other approaches to this. That's the same in Ethiopia. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Lola. Another question came in, this one for Joe Powell. So when you were presenting the results of your crowdsourcing effort, you mentioned that you got a lot of responses from government, folks working in government. And the question was, are these people sort of acting in a whistleblower capacity to draw attention to real issues in the response to COVID-19? Or are these sort of publicly stated concerns or suggestions coming from different governments?
So for the most part, they were public initiatives and reforms that governments were undertaking. And I think when we analyzed the types of initiatives that people were submitting to the crowdsourcing, which gets, I think, to the point in the question, is about 80% of them are on proactive releasing. So, for example, was sharing health data, sharing where citizens could get help or tested and so on, and much less about the accountability side or where kind of whistleblowing or reporting of corruption may come in. And that may have been just because when we launched the crowdsourcing effort, we were in the first phase of the response. So clearly there was a big need for fast, accurate, and open public information. But it feels to me like as we move through into this recovery phase in many countries, although not all by any means, there will be a greater need for the accountability part. And that's where obviously some of the things that Lola and Hamzy talked about, implementation of anti-corruption laws, getting democratic accountability back up and running where parliaments have been suspended, for example. There's clearly a lot that has to be done there.
Thank you, Joe. That's great. Another question coming in from A. McGill and asking, I'll put this one to Hamzy, but if other folks also want to chime in after Hamzy, please feel free to. So the question is, are we seeing or hearing calls for anti-profiteering laws and decrees? Is there guidance or best practices for these? How does one mitigate the risk of these being used as a tool for political score settling or forced wealth transfer? So Hamzy, that's for you.
So we had a webinar with the Bureau of Public Procurement, because of emergency procurement and knowing that most of over 80% of these resources will go towards procurement, and corruption happened in that stage. So we had this webinar, and afterwards the Bureau of Public Procurement published a guideline on procurement practice during a pandemic like COVID-19, and now they're having series of town hall meeting, even with the Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission, which is an anti-corruption agency in Nigeria. The ICPC also published their own guidelines on COVID-19 procurement, and government have been strong to say that if payments would be made, they must always leave a digital trail of payments, so no cash payments should be made. But that being said, there've been some political undertones. So for instance, the ICPC guideline made the chairman of the Presidential Task Force, who is the secretary of the government, but Mustafa, as the sole administrator of the COVID-19 resources. So what this means is there's lack of checks and balance on that front. So he decides who gets what, when, and how. So, and this is an ongoing conversation we're having and saying, you know, this guideline also contradicts what the Bureau of Public Procurement talks about. So they've been that conversation, and we have been trying to have, you know, create that forum where BPE and ICPC would have a conversation, and maybe they could review their guidelines and have just one singular guideline. So government MDs don't have to keep issuing guidelines that contradicts themselves.
Thank you, Hamzi. Wanted to give other folks, Lola and Joe, a chance to answer that question as well, if they have thoughts. So again, the question is, are we seeing or hearing calls for anti-profiteering laws and decrees?
Just one quick thing I want to add to this, and you know, that's because I read the question. I thought that's a fantastic question, and that's a recommendation I had for Hamzi and his colleagues in the civil society community, where they hold government accountable, because that's definitely a risk that will happen. The person who asked the question makes a good point that there could be calls for anti-profiteering laws or decrees, but there is also that concern that it can be abused. We've seen this with anti-money laundering laws being abused at the expense of civil society organizations in the past. So it's really, they could be abused to, you know, to help political officers, you know, settle scores, as you put it. And so I want to just add to some of the things that I hope the civil society organizations can work on, and businesses also can work on, which is around things like the guidelines that the Bureau of Procurement published and what law enforcement can do. But another thing also that we're looking at probably doing in Kenya is also preparing for audits, giving notice to the Ministry of Health, for instance, or to other ministries that are involved in the response, that you know, there will be audits, there can be audits by civil society organizations, and that will you know, create a sense of responsibility as governments respond during the crisis, instead of, you know, having outright laws that could potentially have a worse knock-on effect.
Thanks, Lola. Joe, do you want to take a whack at this question? No obligation, but if you'd like to, feel free.
No, it's a tough question. I think the again, not to sound too trite, but I think the you know, without the open data, and I think someone else has asked this of Hamzi as well, without the open data to actually see even where profiteering may be taking place, it becomes really difficult to even think about how to mitigate the risk of that. So one example I point people to is in Ukraine. I don't know if anyone's on from Ukraine, but Ukraine has been one of the also one of those interesting examples of where a political change of circumstances allowed reformers to go in government and really open up the procurement system. And what they did with COVID response is they adapted that to look at provincial PPE procurement in Ukraine, and saw that there was potentially some evidence of companies profiteering, just looking at the cost comparison between what governors were buying in terms of PPE equipment, and some really big disparities. So to me, that's step one before bringing in the legal instrument, I guess, similar to what Lola's saying. But then, of course, whether there is a political element under that, and the degree to which certain provinces may be being punished, or you know, obviously I can't say, but I mentioned earlier the Colombian Attorney General investigation into 10 mayors. That Attorney General is also investigating 14 governors. So I guess the final thing I'd say on this is it has to be local level data and enforcement. I suspect that's where we'll see more of the disparity and interesting political differences between governors of different parties, potentially from the national government.
Thanks, Joe. Next question comes from Jackman Kwaku, who asks, Hamzi, how can we collect data to properly follow the money in countries where data are not easily accessible or even not available at all? So a question for Hamzi.
Well, that's an interesting question. So even in Nigeria here, where we have some level of data, the data is never enough. So for instance, we don't even have our spending data right now. So we, as much as we know how much governments have gotten, and even if you look at our data around, you know, our debt profile, you know, we still don't have data on what is being spent right now on COVID-19. And so, for instance, in the Gambia, they don't even have access to information law or freedom of information law, you know, to invoke. But in the case of Nigeria and in Kenya, you know, that have access to information law, we're collaborating with SERAP, for instance, to write jointly FOI letter, even with budget and EIE, so that it comes with more weight, that civil society organizations are more organizing and they're speaking with one voice. And in any case where government is not responding, and if you're following the trend in Nigeria, SERAP is helping us, you know, sue government and take them to court to get the judiciary to compel government to release data for us. But for us, what we've also done is, you know, leverage on trusted sources and some champions inside government to give us data. And what we also do is disaggregate this data and publish it and make it machine readable, and also translate this data so that citizens can understand this information and give feedback ultimately. Because for us, it's about collecting feedback and then taking this feedback to inform policy and decision making to government people.
Thank you, Hamzi. The next question is from Jen Lewis of USAID, and it's something that we've been talking about a lot within CIPE, and I know with some of our anti-corruption partners. So Jen's question, could be for anybody, is how do you think we can best leverage this COVID moment and the attention being paid to corruption so as to galvanize the longer-term accountability commitments and coalitions for reform? So I'll ask it one more time. It's to anybody. My question is, how do you think we can best leverage this COVID moment and the attention being paid to corruption to galvanize longer-term accountability commitments and coalitions for reform? Any volunteers for that question?
Happy to start, Frank. This is Joe again. I think it's a great question, Jen. This is, you know, we spend a lot of time obviously thinking about what needs to happen right now, and this kind of sense of siege that I think the anti-corruption community / open government community has felt in the last few months. But it is important at the same time to just kind of raise our eyes a little bit and look to what the longer term opportunities might be. And in this kind of spirit of building back better, you know, there's no reason why systemic shifts on corruption cannot be made in the same way that people in the climate movement are thinking about the opportunities for green transitions post-pandemic. So, you know, a couple of kind of hopeful signs, I think. One I mentioned in my presentation is that you know, the leaders, including Justin Trudeau and Denmark and others, who had said that companies who are registered in tax havens would not be eligible to receive bailout funds. I would love to see that become a lever and a kind of jumping off point to make it, to really have the international cooperation to clamp down on the use of tax havens for corruption, money laundering, and illicit finance. I mean, it's clearly a problem that many of us have known about for decades now. It requires that international cooperation to truly be effective. Unfortunately, that hasn't been possible so far, beyond the kind of bottom-up movement, for example, to have registries of who controls and owns companies. But that needs to be complemented by some international standard setting. So that might be one issue where there is a shift, a political shift, because of the pandemic. The other one I think that is been so evident is around procurement, and you know, you'll never find a procurement having as much coverage as it has in kind of mainstream press and media coverage than it has in the last few months. And again, I think there could be an opportunity there to set a new norm, which is that there is a right to know about public contracts through from awarding to implementation, and that citizens have a role in monitoring them, and that governments have a responsibility to enforce good standards of implementation and to prosecute where they find corruption. And again, that's something that's been bubbling up, if you like, from a movement-driven way for some time. But could this really become a tipping point where it becomes a new norm and expectation in the anti-corruption field in future? But I'm sure there are others that Jen and other panelists would have their eye on, that could be other systemic shifts that might take place.
Yeah, just to add to what Joe has said, and I like the fact that he talked about standard, but you know, we also need to look at stronger penalties when government floats this standards, because you know, we have the contracting and procurement standard. I know that the IMF loan, for instance, came, you know, our government committed to publishing on the open treasury, you know, so this is also something that could help civil society, like Follow the Money, make our work easier to ensure we collect data from the open treasury portal. The government publish how they're utilizing over $3 million that they just got from IMF. And maybe lastly, I just published a blog post that talks about the game changer around COVID-19. And honestly, it's around OGP as a game changer, but maybe now more focused on subnational government, you know, because, you know, most of the spending actually happen on the ground, the grassroots. So focus more and enhance capacity more and standardization on subnational government. And I've just shared the link to the blog post.
Yeah, just
one.
Go ahead, Lily.
Yeah, just one thing to add, because Joe and Hamzi really made all the points I was going to make, and there's just one more thing I'm going to emphasize. I think that's an excellent question, because we've been thinking about it a lot, and I keep coming back to three questions when I think about it, about what the right answer would be, would come from being able to answer these three questions. Where should the change happen? At what point should the change happen? Should it happen at the point of you know, public action, public administration? Should it happen in citizens' response to public administration's effectiveness? Or where do we want to target this change? A lot of change is happening in civil society ability to respond collectively to governance issues, even whether it's organized or it's spontaneous, like the ones Joe was showing us about. But where do we want to see change happen? At what point is the first question. And then the second one would be, what kind of change do we want to see happen? And I think this is where I'll be talking about, you know, soft interventions, soft power type of change. And then what would make that kind of change sustainable? And so my focus would be, you know, to say, if we can galvanize broad citizens in action or investment in governance in many African countries, that might move the needle a little bit. And for that to happen, the change has to happen at the electoral point, where we're talking about, you know, electoral corruption. There's just a big disconnect between what majority of citizens in Africa expect from their government versus what they want from their government. I dare explain that many citizens in Africa don't realize that they want their government to be corrupt. They don't realize that. That's what they demand. Quick example, and Hamzi would understand this from the Nigeria setting. You know, member of parliament, for instance, and we've seen this in the Gambia too, would be, you know, insulted and sent away from his community because he can't provide potable drinking water or, you know, cars or entrepreneurial gifts for the entrepreneurs in his community. And he will have to embezzle funds to do that because those funds might be provided through some other government budget. And so that disconnect between what citizens expect from politicians and what they actually want from politicians needs to be fixed, so that there is a critical mass of citizens that are holding the government accountable. And it's not those few collective, organized civil society groups like Hamzi and you know, CIPE partners, but there is a broader call for accountability. And it's in those social dynamics and interventions that I think that we need to focus on to ride on the wings of this pandemic and have systemic change.
Lola, that's a really good point. And that touches upon something that we've been talking about a lot, which is this, and this is really reflected in Jen's question, but looking at the day after. So the day after the sort of immediate response to the crisis, at what kind of long-term changes could be put in place. And our sense is, when I say our, I mean CIPE's sense is that because a healthcare crisis impacts people in such a broad and sort of equal way, the corruption dimensions of it are especially poignant and personal. So unlike, say, grand corruption, which can seem very abstract, or petty corruption with the traffic police, for example, corruption that impacts the ability of governments to respond adequately to this crisis affect people's loved ones and family and friends. And there's no more sort of powerful, in my experience, form of corruption in terms of getting people engaged than healthcare corruption. And that's, I think, one reason we feel such potential in this moment to build long-lasting solutions and really, on a global level, try to do what Joe has been describing. With that, I just wanted to mention that in the chat section, Hamzi has posted the blog that he mentioned, and then Joe has also posted a reference to the Ukrainian example that he mentioned. So we've got about 15 more minutes left in the Q&A, and I wanted to go to one more question. We have time for a couple more if folks want to put them in the chat session, but we've got one here from Olumide Areo, and asking for Lola, are there any specific support by CIPE to informal or formal youth-led movements or groups which helps to build the capacity of young people in democratic discourse within their immediate community, regions, and country? That's for Lola.
So CIPE works with the informal sector in Zimbabwe, to some extent in Kenya, and you know, the focus being to empower businesses to advocate effectively for, you know, policy reforms or even just changes that, you know, would make the business environment better, more friendly, more transparent. There is a lot, you know, a lot of challenges with informal sector businesses because they are usually not represented. And so we in Zimbabwe and in Kenya work with these groups to try to get their voices heard by the government. When you say youth-led movements and groups, I get the sense that means something different from, you know, a particular, you know, business-focused group of, you know, informal organizations working together. So if you mean just movements that, you know, tackle pressing issues in the countries where they are, I don't have any knowledge of us supporting those kinds of groups unless they're, you know, backed by some business or entrepreneurial interest. And then, you know, there's a connect with what CIPE's core strengths and capacities are. I hope I understood your question correctly, and I hope I answered it adequately for you. But please feel free to, you know, make clarifications if we didn't understand the question.
Thank you, Lola. I wanted to give Joe a chance to build upon Hamzi's answer regarding countries' commitments to how they're going to spend their IMF, World Bank support. Joe?
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, I just wanted to really support Hamzi's idea, which is, you know, that there was, when this big capital was being mobilized from the IMF and the World Bank, a lot of civil society organizations, including my former the One Campaign, but many others, were really pushing the international financial institutions to ensure that there were transparency provisions built into the emergency financing that countries were requesting. So if you look at, with the IMF, for example, you can actually access what each country has committed to as part of the accessing of that finance. And these are commitments that citizens were demanding, right? So I don't see it in quite the same way as a sort of old school conditionality around aid. It's much more that citizens were really demanding to see how this money would be spent in their name, and of course adding in some cases to debt. So I think it's really important that the governments are then held to account on the commitments they have made. And historically, you know, there's been a big disconnect between what governments have promised to do, if you like, on the global stage in forums like with the IMF and the World Bank, and what's actually been implemented locally. So I think that's where the follow the money movement is so crucial, because we can actually join the dots between those international commitments that were necessary to access some of this emergency finance, and then how that actually plays out even at the local and subnational level. And that's a big challenge, to connect the dots from Washington to subnational implementation in some of the contexts we've talked about. But if we don't do that, then I think we'll also miss, if you like, the opportunity to embed a bit more some of these norms about how some of the international aid and financing is used in the future beyond the pandemic.
Thank you, Joe. One other question we have has come in, this one from a Kai Bernier Chen, who asks to Hamzi, could you share any recent successes from your follow the money efforts at getting governments to open up about how funding is being used and how procurement is being handled during the pandemic? Where in Africa have they recently made a difference? Hamzi?
Thank you. I would say in Zimbabwe, in Liberia, and in Nigeria. And just to give one quick example, here in Nigeria. So when we had our town hall meeting that was hosted by AIT, AIT is one of the national private TV station that had the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs. At that forum, she was able to give concrete data on how much have been spent so far in providing relief to people on the ground. But also, we've also have a channel open where government also provides and gets information from citizens like us. And now government invite us, you know, when they're doing outreach. And now we're informing government community engagement strategy. Oh yes. So Follow the Money is now helping government to build a community engagement strategy around COVID-19 spread, because right now government is dealing with community infection and spread of COVID-19, and we are the ones who have, you know, the biggest on-ground boots in various grassroots communities. So, and in doing that, we're also getting real-time data on how much commitment is going towards this effort, both by government and development partners, and using this information to also share with the general public. And for procurement, We've gotten commitment that government will publish the list of all this procurement being done. And, we're following up this commitment and putting pressure using radio, using social media to ensure that government actually come through with this commitment. And if you look at the president's speech so far after the pandemic, he always emphasized on the work that we do around transparency and accountability and around procurement in the country. So, our Follow COVID-19 campaign, have really put a lot of pressure and attention on how government is responding, but most importantly, how citizens are also getting voices and ensuring their voices are heard during this period. And we've also used this opportunity to build capacity for a lot of young people using digital skills and digital tools to hold government to account and run, transparency and accountability campaign in not just Nigeria, but Africa at large.
Thank you, Hamzy. That's very, very interesting. And I think we are likely to come back to Hamzy, given the scope and novelty and innovation in his programs, and do a blog on his work. So please stay tuned for that. I wanted to remind folks who are listening that if you'd like to get a recording of this event and a PowerPoint, just let us know in the chat function. It'll also be available on our COVID-19 and corruption WhatsApp channel. If you'd like to join that channel, just send us your WhatsApp number in the chat box, and we'll subscribe you to that. We also have a Twitter feed. Caitlin, if you don't mind showing that Twitter address, we have a Twitter feed where we push out all this information. You can stay up to date on the latest developments, not just at CIPE. We mostly tweet about other organizations' work and news developments, and that Twitter feed will be on your screen. And if you'd like to get our newsletter, drop us a line at that email address, acgc@cipe.org. We've got one more question from a Peter Glover, who asks, COVID-19 and government responses to it affect different people differently. What steps should be taken to push governments to make their responses sensitive to gender, age, etc.? So Joe, maybe do you want to take a stab at that? We have about 8 minutes left, so if you want to give us a quick answer, we'll have time for Lola and Hamzy to chime in as well. Joe?
Sure. I mean, this is, I think any effective stimulus and response has to be inclusive. I mean, that's easy to say, but harder to do in practice. So one of the things that I think we've been talking, for example, with the South African government and civil society about is ensuring that people in the informal economy receive some of the benefits that the government is providing using the tax database, which otherwise won't include those people. We've also seen, as many of us will be aware, a spike in gender-based violence in many countries. That also requires a specific response. Even in where I live in Washington, D.C., there's been a spike in gender-based violence, and the government has tried to respond with providing additional safe houses and such like. So if you're not thinking through from a gender and inclusion perspective, then your entire response will be less effective. And I think that's been our approach when we've been discussing with our government members, has been to come at it from that angle, right? It's to say that if you actually want to meet the expectations of your citizens and build trust through the pandemic, which is something that we have seen in some contexts, trust in government actually increase, but that will not be sustainable unless you think about how to do that in an inclusive way. And the final thing I would say, because it's come up in several of the other questions that people have raised, is the local and subnational dimension is clearly critical. Just to give one advertisement, at OGP we are currently recruiting for 50 new members of our OGP local program. They can come from any OGP member country around the world. We already have about 20, including Kaduna State in Nigeria, Austin, Texas in the US, and Paris, Madrid, many others. But would really encourage anybody who's interested in this local subnational work to think about that opportunity if you know of local governments that are doing really great work on inclusive response to to COVID.
Thanks, Joe. Lola, do you want to take a stab at that question?
I think Joe and Hamzi might have better responses, because I'm just at the point where we're redefining risk management protocols for companies, and this is one question we're looking at. Risk management should be all-encompassing. We're thinking through integrated compliance, and so we're still mulling on how to make sure, from a business perspective, crisis response is sensitive to gender and different groups. And we're now starting to think about that in the context of the government's COVID response, because in Nigeria and in Kenya and in South Africa, we've been hearing about real challenges or violence against women happening during this period. And there's just so much to learn and understand about that, because we're not sure why there's a spike. If it's always been there, it's just getting reported better. So I really want to hear and learn from what Joe and Hamzi might have to say on this one.
Yeah, Hamzi, do you want to take a whack at that?
So CODE is part of a response team, a rapid response team on gender-based violence because of the spike of the lockdown, and there've been increase of reports. So we're part of this broader gender-based violence team because of our experience in ensuring gender integration in our campaigns, and also reflect on CODE's staff strength, because we have over 70% of female at the organization, and at management level over 80%. So so we're also taking this to inform government decision and government action. But honestly, it's a bit slow from the government side, because it's a learning curve. Honestly, it's a learning curve both for government and some other organization, and then building up on the VAP Act, and the Child Rights Act. So and now we're getting even the Governors Forum, the Executive Council to adopt a policy and a framework to get all the states to adopt it. But culture and religion plays a big role, and they have a big influence, and this is something we're dealing with currently.
Thank you very much. So just a couple minutes left, and Lola generously has a question for Hamzi and Joe that I think is really useful. So let me just quickly find it here. And in the meantime, I'll mention that in the chat section, you'll see there's Joe has posted a link for OGP local application opportunities, in case that's of interest to anybody. So Lola's question for Joe and Hamzi, we'll just have to answer very, very quickly in a minute or so. Her question is, how can organized business support their anti-corruption efforts, considering that business enables corruption directly or indirectly? So in other words, how can business organized, I suppose, into associations and chambers support their anti-corruption efforts, considering that business is a big factor in corruption, either directly or indirectly? Joe, do you want to take that first? We have about 1 minute. Yeah.
Very quick.
Just 1 minute. Just one thing, Joe. The "dear" means your, so that's the civil society. Yeah, it means. Sorry, Frank. I meant to say civil society, and so that's you and Hamzi's community.
I mean, in many OGP fora, we have civil society or private sector chambers of commerce type organizations in the forum. In fact, in Nigeria, Hamzi, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they're currently the co-chair of the forum. So that is, but it's happening in too few places, and this is where, with the CIPE and the CIPE network, we really need to bring this more centrally in. It should be a conversation with government, civil society, and the private sector. In many OGP countries, we're missing the private sector engagement, whether through individual companies or through Chamber of Commerce type associations. So that's something that we'd love to explore with all of you and do better on in the future.
I think from our side is to provide incentive for them to have policies in place, policies and processes in place. particularly around whistleblowing, because as much as we're recruiting champions from government to generate revenue, and they're more keen on profit. So yeah, it's to create avenue for incentive for them to have all these policies and system and process in place, and give them that avenue to showcase that that incentive would put them on the global map to access more businesses and profit.
Thank you so much, Hamzi. That's a great way to end this event. I wanted to say thank you so much for all the good questions, for the active participation of the folks who are on this, and especially to the presenters, because I know you're very, very busy people. So thank you for your time, and thank you for all the good work you're doing. Again, on your screen, you see ways to get in touch with us if you'd like to stay up to date on COVID-19 and corruption issues. My colleague posted in the chat section the details for another event starting right now regarding Sudan and anti-corruption, featuring Sudanese Minister of Justice, US Ambassador, and several experts on Sudan and corruption. So feel free to tune into that. It's a big morning for us at CIPE on anti-corruption issues. Stay tuned for our next event in 2 weeks on our anti-corruption and COVID-19 series. And thank you very much for joining.